a little different than most. You have two jobs as a jury. One is to determine the facts, and the other is to apply the law, as Judge Hogan will give you the law, to those facts. In most cases, determining the facts is the hard part. Once you've figured out what the facts are, usually it's pretty easy to apply the law. Well, this one is more or less the opposite. That is, there's not a whole lot of disagreement about the facts. Some, certainly, not everything is agreed, but the basic outline of what happened, there's little dispute. The question for you, the biggest question is, how do you apply the law to those facts? For example, cause of death, a legal term, was what Mr. Middlemiss did, a cause of death. And you'll hear, among other things, it has to be something without which the death would not have occurred. And I suggest that when you listen to the medical examiner, and you listen, and you use your common sense, you'll realize that Mr. Middlemiss's actions were not something without which the death would not have occurred. Mr. Morgan was the only one who did that. And then, of course, you've heard the judge talk about beyond reasonable doubt, another legal term that you're going to have to apply. And obviously, she will define it for you. I'm not going to attempt to do that. But you have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. There's elements of the crimes that you have to discuss. For instance, for first-degree murder, you have to find either that it was premeditated, and I suggest there's very scant evidence, to say the least, of that. I think all the evidence, you heard Mr. Glenn testify, is that it was a reaction by Chris Middlemiss. He thought Alberto Citron was going to get Joe Morgan's gun and kill them both. That it wasn't anything that was premeditated. The other way you could fight him, the other theory that the government is proceeding on, is that this was an attempted robbery. Well, you'll hear that for attempt, there has to be an act which comes reasonably close to completing the crime. I suggest that that's not what happened here, that nobody ever asked for money, reached for money. There was nothing that anybody did towards a robbery in this case. And of course, for both first degree and second degree, you have to find beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Middlemiss was responsible for the death. Now, there's a way that somebody can be held responsible if they don't actually do the act. And that's called a joint venture. Again, the judge will tell you in detail what a joint venture is. It's basically when two people get together to do something. And that's a very vague definition, and you'll hear much more about that. But one of the things that's required for a joint venture is that both people share the intent to commit the same crime. I suggest that that's not what happened here. I think the evidence certainly shows that Mr. Morgan was not there to commit robbery. Now, how do we know that? He certainly was talking about robbery, but you know what they say, actions speak louder than words. What were his actions when he got there? There's a scuffle. Interesting question. Who started the scuffle? We'll probably never know that. Between him and Mr. Citron. Mr. Citron then, Mr. Middlemiss, in an attempt to, because he's afraid that Mr. Citron's going to get the gun, shoots and wounds Mr. Citron. Mr. Citron is on the ground with money bulging out of his pocket. Now, if you're a stands over somebody who's already wounded and shoots him. That's execution-style killing. And that was what Mr. Morgan did. An execution-style killing. Now, and for any degree, any kind of murder charge, you have to find that either individually or by joint venture, Mr. Middlemiss caused the death of Albert Syndrome. And I suggest that. And you have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And I suggest that that's sorely lacking in this case. That Joseph Morgan is the one who did it. And why did he do it? Well, you heard about the affair between him and Mr. Cintron's girlfriend. Now, you heard two witnesses who said the affair was over. And you heard from two sources that it wasn't. First, Curtis Glenn said, oh yeah, the affair was over. And where does he get his information from? Well, he gets it from Alberto Cintron. We know that. Where do you think Alberto Cintron gets the information that the affair is over? Suggests that the logical deduction, the logical inference, is that he gets it from Angie. Got a reliable source? Sure, it's all over between me and Mr. Morgan and Slow Joe. It's all over. Well, you know, because I think you've heard enough about Angie to understand that she likes being with Mr. Morgan, with Mr. Cintron, who has lots of money. You heard she went to a party and bragged about all the money and all the good things they had in the apartment, all the good stuff she had. So she's not going to tell him. She's carrying on an affair. You also heard it from Christopher Middlemiss when he said to the Miami police that Mr. Morgan was banging, I believe was his word, Mr. Cintron's girlfriend. Now, why should you believe that's the defendant? Why should you believe him? Well, I suggest, for once, at this point, he hasn't even figured out that Joseph Morgan set him up. He has no reason to make this up. And if you listen to that tape, CD, you'll hear, up until the point where he claims that the gun wasn't loaded, there's nothing he says that's contradicted by any of the evidence in this case. It all flows naturally. He does say the gun wasn't loaded. Of course, you heard Lieutenant Aguilar. He was the one who first brought up that in a question, trying to minimize the involvement, which was the psychological ploy that's used. And of course, Mr. Middlemiss jumps for it. All right, the gun wasn't loaded. Good idea. Obviously, shouldn't have said that. But I suggest if you listen before that, you listen carefully, you'll hear that what he says is absolutely corroborated. There's certainly nothing that's contradicted by the other evidence in this case. Then you also heard from both Colin Fergerer and Scott Wilson. Both of them cooperating witnesses. Now you heard what Judge Hogan already told you about cooperating witnesses. That you should view their testimony with extra caution. And obviously that applies to both of them, except one little difference. The reason you have to regard their testimony with great caution is because they may be tempted to slant it in favor of the government. There is certainly no reason why a cooperating witness, no motive whatsoever, to slant it in favor of a defendant. And I suggest in that case, it is Mr. Fergerer who is more credible. I'd suggest that Scott Russell is just the kind of person who was out to help himself. Also, by the way, you heard Scott Russell is the one who's been convicted of 5 prior crimes before this. Does that sound like somebody you want to believe? Scott Russell is also the one who told you he looked the police in the eye and lied to them. Even after they confronted him, he continued to lie. Mr. Ferber made one stab at lying, didn't work. When they said to Mr. Ferber it was bullshit, and to Mr. Russell, don't dance with us, you saw the different reactions. Mr. Russell, oh no, what I'm telling you was the truth, as he continued to lie and to minimize his involvement. You also heard, by the way, on the tape, that Mr. Middlemiss says that Mr. Russell was supposed to be the second person to go upstairs until the last minute. I suggest that there's some evidence that certainly corroborates that. You heard both Mr. Ferber and Mr. Russell talk about how the first phone call to Mr. Ferber was for 1 gun. The second was for 2 guns. If Mr. Middlemiss was supposed to go up there with Mr. Morgan the entire time, does that make any sense? How about this? If Mr. Russell was going to go up there, and he's the one on the phone, and he decides he wants to chicken out, but he doesn't want to tell Slow Joe Morgan that Slow Joe's going up there alone, what does he do? He tells his buddy Colin, just bring 1 gun. Figuring, gets here with 1 gun. I can't go up there without a gun, so that lets me off the hook. Then he persuades Mr. Middlemiss to take his place. Now, that's the second phone call. Bring 2 guns. I mean, otherwise I don't know how that gets explained. So when Mr. Middlemiss, as I said, when he told you on that tape that Mr. Russell was supposed to go up there at first and he was a last-minute replacement, I think there's some corroboration of that. I think that makes perfect sense. Otherwise, what happened? And Mr. Russell, by the way, gets a full share of this endeavor, because he's going to sell the proceeds to Strawberries. He's going to be getaway navigator, or the getaway front seat passenger. Suggest that he, again, at the beginning, he was supposed to be a full participant. Decided not to do it. Obviously, at that point, it gets really tough when somebody knows the entire plan to cut them out. Now, of course, he told you that wasn't true. There's some vague talk about him doing it, but it was never part of the plan. Again, Mr. Russell, quite the piece of work. I suggest to you that he is just the kind of person who would set it up, duck out, and then say whatever he had to say. This is the man who told the police, don't arrest me, I'll testify to whatever you want. Now, you'll see that you know that there are only 2 charges against Mr. Middlemiss. One is possession of a firearm, and the other is murder. Possession of a firearm probably should take you about 2 minutes to find Mr. Middlemiss guilty. And there's no question there. So the other question is murder. Did Mr. Middlemiss in some way cause the death? key question here. Or to put it a little more legally, did the Commonwealth prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Middlemiss caused the death? Either, and as I told you before, it could be as a joint venture, but the reason it can't be is because they didn't share the intent. That is, Mr. Middlemiss's intent was to rob, Mr. Morgan's intent was to kill. If that's the case, there cannot be a joint venture. And if there's no joint venture, then the question is, are you convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Middlemiss, that his actions were the cause of Alberto Citron's death? I'd say after you heard the medical examiner's testimony, he wasn't about to say, he couldn't say beyond a reasonable doubt, he couldn't even say to a degree of medical certainty. He couldn't say for sure anything, frankly. And, talk about reasonable doubt. He had reasonable doubt. The government witness had reasonable doubt, or more. Now, it puts you in a very, very tough position, because we all agree that Mr. Middlemiss shot somebody. If you believe that the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he shot him, but not proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed him, what can you do? There's no charge related to shooting. There's a gun possession charge, but nothing related to the actual act of shooting. So that means that you have to, if you have a reasonable doubt about whether he caused the death, you have to find him not guilty.
Now, in Mr. Beck's closing comments, it's a little bit different than his opening comments. In the opening statement, what he said was that there was this great secret plan that Mr. Morgan had that he didn't share with anyone else, and that Mr. Middlemiss didn't realize this secret plan. He had this entire hidden agenda, this big secret plan to murder, which he didn't share with anyone. That wasn't really mentioned in the closing. That's what the theory was. I assume that's what he's alluding to when he says that Mr. Morgan didn't share the intent. Well, that's what Mr. Beck says. But what did Christopher Middlemiss say when he was interviewed by the Miami Police Department? Mr. Middlemiss said Joe Morgan wanted to rob him for money. That's what Mr. Middlemiss said 2 weeks after. I'm not going to engage in speculative theories about what happened. I'm going to stick with the facts. I'm going to ask you to concentrate on the facts and draw reasonable inferences from those facts. Let's talk about what Christopher Middlemiss said about the plan. Pretty straightforward. The plan was that we're going to go up into the apartment, scare him with a gun, take his money, and be gone. A straightforward robbery. He said Joe Morgan wanted to rob him for money. That was their plan. Then, what did he say happened? He said they followed through that plan and they went out. And what else did you learn about the plan? We learned this plan had been going on for some time. There had been some discussion, general at first, about the possibility of robbing Alberto Citron because he sold drugs and had money and things. They talked about various ways of doing it. But there wasn't any real urgency. And then, as time passed, Joseph Morgan, who was living at 115 Shaw Street, started getting pressure from home, from Jesse Supernaught. You got to come up with money for rent. And as for Middlemiss, you can't live here for nothing. And then, still no definite plan. But then, what happened? Joe Morgan's driving up to Hampton Beach and his car breaks down. It's on the side of the road he doesn't want to impound. He comes back, and now there's urgency. Now he wants to act, and he wants money now to pay for the car, to get it out of impound, to make sure it doesn't get impounded. And so, in that situation, in haste, they hatched this plan. It's a half-baked plan, admittedly. First, they talk about, oh, they're going to rob him outside the bar. They're going to go to a bar bar, rob them outside this bar, and they start going forward with the plan of putting on the masks, putting on the hoods, and they can't even get it done quickly enough that they get there before, in time. So the plan changes, and they hatch a new plan. We'll just go upstairs. And that's the plan they settle on. They agree to go out. And according to Christopher Middlemiss, the plan is Joe wanted to rob the woman. And Chris Middlemiss said, I had his back. Now what does that mean? I had his back. I suggest to you that what it means is, if anything goes wrong, I'll take action. I'll come to your side. I'll help you. I suggest that's exactly what happened. So they plan this robbery, and they go upstairs. But before they go up, they put on their bandanas. Now they don't really think it through very well. They don't think about, for example, whether anyone's going to be suspicious of somebody who has his face covered, but his eyes exposed, when he confronts someone who's spoken with him recently and discussed the fact that he has a black eye. But they don't take that adequately into account. And they don't take adequately into account what's going to happen when someone walks into his apartment and his Rottweiler is in the bathroom and not barking, and there's an intruder in the house. They don't really consider all the possibilities of how things could go wrong. And they don't consider what will happen. He recognized. They go forward. They have a conversation in the bedroom. The guns are passed around. They mess around with the guns. They see the guns are loaded. The guns are loaded with .45 caliber hollow point bullets. Because although Chris Middlemiss says he's going up there just to cover Joseph Morgan's back, I suggest the evidence supports that he was prepared to act if necessary. He didn't go up there, as he said to the Miami police, with an empty gun. He went up there with a loaded gun. A loaded gun, loaded with hollow point ammunition. .45 caliber hollow point ammunition. He was prepared to cover his back if necessary. He was equipped and armed to do exactly that. And so they got the guns, and they put on the masks, and they pulled up the hoods, and they headed up the stairs. And they went into the apartment. Christopher Middlemiss says he went in the living room. Joseph Morgan went in the kitchen. They stuck the dog in the bathroom, because as Christopher Middlemiss, you've heard, witnesses knew the dog, was friendly with the dog. And they waited. And then what happened? Alberto Cintron came home with a friend, Curtis Hill. And as Christopher Middlemiss said, things went wrong. Things didn't go as planned. They didn't just scare him with the gun, take his money, and be gone. Things didn't go according to plan. Alberto Cintron walks in, and he immediately realizes, where's the dog? They put a gun to his head, a laser to his head, tell him to get down. But does he get down? No, he doesn't get down. He refuses to comply. Big problem for him. Then he lets out the dog. And the dog does what? It runs right over to Chris Middlemiss. But it doesn't attack him. It doesn't bark at him. It just lies down. Another problem. And so then what happens? What you'd expect to happen. Alberto Cintron walks over to Christopher Middlemiss. And he sees him. And he looks at his eyes. And what does he see? The black eye. What does Christopher Middlemiss say happened? That's what he says happens. He's the black eye. And he says, Chris? So at that moment, Christopher Middlemiss realizes things have gone very, very wrong. Alberto Cintron has recognized him, and Alberto Cintron is not complying. They put a gun to Alberto Cintron, but he didn't go down. So what does Alberto Cintron do now? Alberto Cintron goes back into the kitchen, and he starts to wrestle with Joe Morgan, trying to disarm him, trying to get the gun. And that is the moment. That is the moment when Christopher Middlemiss has to make a decision, isn't he? He's got all the information he needs right now. He knows he's been recognized. He knows that Alberto Cintron may get that gun. And as the court will inform you, when you're talking about deliberation, it doesn't have to last for a long period of time. It can be a matter of seconds. And I suggest to you in those seconds, he had to make a decision what to do. Do I fulfill my obligation to cover my friend's back? Do I cover my own butt and take action? What do I do? But you don't have to speculate or guess about it. Call Furter. Told you what he said. Mr. Beck says Mr. Furter's testimony. In any event, Mr. Furter told you what he said, what he was thinking. He says Chris Middlemiss said he was thinking, shoot or be shot. So what does he do? You heard the testimony about what he did. Not what he told Miami police about how he was unarmed and looked in and basically left, and Joe Morgan did everything else. Joe Morgan fired all the shots. No. What is the testimony, the incredible testimony that you heard about that? What did Curtis Glenn say happened? Christopher Middlemiss says he's in the living room with a gun, holding a gun, and Curtis Glenn was on the ground. Now what does Curtis Glenn say happens? He says that the guy with the gun in the living room goes running toward the kitchen. And what does he do? He lifts up the gun and he aims it. A .45 caliber gun with hollow point bullets in it. And he aims it. And then what happens? He points it at Alberto Cintron. What does Joe Morgan do? Joe Morgan's in a headlock. No! No! What does Christopher Middlemiss do? He fires that shot. At that point, does he stop? He's got a .45 caliber gun. Joseph Morgan's got a .45 caliber gun. They fired a shot at this guy. Then what happens? 4 shots fired. He fires again and again, and they fire a total of 5 shots. Well, 6 shots, 5 of which hit him. They hit him in the chest, they hit him in the abdomen, they hit him in the back, and it goes through the lung. They hit him in the shoulder, and they hit him in the back again. The medical examiner, contrary to what Mr. Beck said, I suggest, told you those shots together caused his death. And there was so much blood loss from the organs that were hit that it's impossible to tell any one organ, one shot was hit, because there were so many organs hit. The lungs were damaged. The kidney was damaged. The liver was grazed. They fired shot after shot because, I suggest, they didn't want to deal with the reality of Alberto Cintron living, knowing that he had recognized them. So they fired out shots. Now, there's Alberto Cintron. He's on the floor. Christopher Middlemiss talks to Miami police and he tries to put all the blame on Joseph Morgan. He says that it was Morgan's fault and that he ran out the door separately. Middlemiss followed later. Morgan followed later. Well, you heard from Marquino Bailey. Kid who lived across the street. He sees Curtis Glenn jump out the window. And then what does he see? 2 people run down the back stairs, across the street, right toward his window, together. Now, there was talk about why didn't take the money. The plan here was a robbery. That was the plan. They were going up to rob him. It wasn't well thought out. But once that moment came and they acted and they shot, they weren't about to were getting out of there. They panicked and they ran. They weren't going to be rifling his pants looking for money. They were gone. And they took off and went down those back stairs. I suggest that's completely consistent with what you'd expect under the circumstances. And then they get in the car. And once they get in the car, they tell Colin Furter and Scott Russell what happened. Russell says, how much we get or words to that effect. And they tell him exactly, well, they tell him what happened, according to both of those witnesses. They tell him what each of them said. You should compare what Furter and Russell said to each other and to what Curtis Glenn said, and to what Christopher Middlemiss said, and what the physical evidence is. And I suggest to you that it all fits together. And they said something in particular that was interesting. Christopher Middlemiss and Joseph Morgan later as well. If he's dead, we'll be all right. If he's dead, we'll be all right. Now what does that mean? I suggest to you what that means is, if he's dead, they won't find out what happened inside that apartment. And they'll be all right. As you know, the evidence in this case, Alberto Cintron died shortly after they left the apartment. EMT reported that they got to the scene, they took him to the hospital, which is only 4 minutes away. He stopped breathing on the way. He coded by the time they arrived at the hospital. He was dead shortly thereafter. If he's dead, they'll be all right. But what they didn't count on was that he didn't die right away. He got to a phone, and he placed a 911 call. Placed a 911 call while he was...
Hey, police 911, this line's being recorded. What is your emergency?
I was shot in Kentucky.
Okay, sir, where are you? Where are you? In Lowell, Mass?
Yeah.
Okay, do you know what street you're on? What's around you, sir?
Shot.
Where were you shot?
On the corner of Shaw and School Street.
You were shot on School Street?
Shaw and School Street.
Okay, so shot on School Street, that's where you are? You're on the corner right there?
Yeah.
Okay, where were you shot? You said you were shot 3 times. Where?
I'm looking but
Okay, stay put, okay? Don't move. Hold on, sir, okay?
yeah.
You know who shot you? You do?
Yeah.
Okay, who was it?
Downstairs neighbor, Parker Blue.
911, what's the address of your emergency? Told us today, I could tell you online that you were just shot 3 times at the corner of Shaw and School Street.
Shaw School?
Yeah, what's the kid's name? Chris what?
I don't know.
What street does he live on? He said he knows who shot him. He said it's downstairs.
It's downstairs. Parker Blue. It's very... No, it's got...
They didn't count on the fact that Steve Coyle would arrive shortly thereafter. Officer Stephen Coyle of the Lowell Police Department, who kicked in the door and with the paramedics entered that apartment. And while the paramedics were trying to save Alberto Cintron's life, Steve Coyle testified that he came to his side. And when he's in front of, right next to Alberto Cintron, he asked whether he was going to make it. They didn't give him a positive answer. He told Alberto Cintron, "You may succumb to your wounds." And then he asked him, "Who shot you?" What did Alberto Cintron say? "Chris. He lives downstairs." If he's dead, they'll be all right. That's what they thought. But at that time, they didn't realize that Colin Furter would subsequently be confronted with the fact that his father had said his holster is missing. The holster that was left in the apartment right below. And the police had the guns that were used. And that Colin Furter would crack. And Colin Furter would tell the police what he told you. And it didn't count on the fact that Scott Russell, when told that Colin Furter had told the police what happened, would also speak. They didn't count on the fact that the police would recover the murder evidence. And so when Christopher Middlemiss is speaking to Miami police and he says, oh, I went up there to cover Joe's back, but then when Alberto grabbed him, or words to that effect, I didn't fire any shots. He doesn't use the words grab, but when the struggle started, whatever his words were, I didn't fire any shots. He didn't know that comparison testing had been done, or would be done. And comparison testing of the shell casings that were found in the apartment would be compared to the shell casings fired from the two weapons. And it would show that both weapons were fired inside that apartment. The time that they were riding in the car and saying, if he's dead, we'll be all right, they had no way of knowing, I suggest, that someone watched them run out of the apartment together. And so, in summary, they had no way of knowing. They made those statements that these facts would come forward. And the facts in this case, I suggest, establish Joseph Morgan and Christopher Middlemiss went up into that apartment with a plan. The plan was to rob Alberto Cintron. Joseph Morgan, Christopher Middlemiss intended to rob him of money, and that when Alberto Cintron resisted, they shot him 5 times. And as a result of those shots, during the course of that robbery, he died. And it wasn't just some preliminary negotiation or discussion they engaged in. They took overt, real steps to complete that robbery. They put on masks, they carried loaded guns, they pointed the guns at them, and they ordered them to the ground.